Hello, everyone. My name is Kyle Matthews. I'm Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. We're pleased to welcome you today for another interview as part of our AI and COVID-19 Disinformation Initiative, a project between Migs and the OSCE's Office of the Representative on the Freedom of the Media, to really understand what's happening at the intersection of AI, COVID disinformation, and what it means for freedom of expression, freedom of speech. So I'd like to welcome Zach Devereaux. Zach, welcome. Tell us a bit about what you do and what's your work on disinformation.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to have this opportunity. My name is Zach Devereaux. I'm the Director of Public Affairs for a company called Nexalogy, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of a TSX traded company called Datametrics AI Limited. And in that role, I've been working on AI and disinformation at the NATO level and at the Canadian Forces level, and also with companies in the private sector over a number of years dealing with these problems. So I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk to you today.
So Zach, let's get right into it. What do you believe are the key challenges raised by digital disinformation during the COVID pandemic?
Well, the big one I would say that spanned a number of years is the echo chamber effect, and really what the echo chamber effect, which we were alerted to in internet research in the 90s, really has played out into the current situation, is that there's multiple realities. We knew there would be echo chambers, but we didn't know they'd be so strong that people would really, as they say in French, alimenter their reality with a total subset of data. So that leads to the idea that there's no longer a single source of truth, that we're in like a post-truth situation. And that's not accurate, but it is how people live their lives. So this leads to disinformation tactics by malign and also domestic actors, and it's confusing to disentangle the two. So I think really the fact that if you want to, you can only see and hear information that aligns with your worldview, which in some cases might be detrimental to your grasp of facts or civil society. I mean, that's a real offset to the attention economy and the fact that people can get into their habits and hobbies and interests in a really profound way in the digital reality.
So Zach, so my next question is, how can artificial intelligence be used to address these challenges?
Well, the AI that we build, what it does, which is a little different, it's a textual-based artificial intelligence, and it can read every post. So one thing we see is that, everybody is familiar with the idea of big data, which was a kind of vogue a few years ago. But big data is real, and any average person can access conversations that are in the tens of thousands of posts. And so understanding conversations on that scale is really important for AI to help us with. So our AI can read every post and then make a summarization that's not just based on frequency, but it's based on context. And our AI can extract entities, what we call, a way to map existing knowledge with new discussions. So for example, the way that I was trying to explain this is that an AI can memorize Wikipedia and then read 10,000 tweets and tell you what was in there that's in Wikipedia. So this compares existing knowledge and a big knowledge base like Wikipedia and a discussion that you're trying to understand, which you could never read 10,000 tweets yourself, but the AI can read all of them. And you could never understand from those 10,000 tweets in like a couple of seconds, what are the themes, and summarize the arguments that are in there. And an AI can do that. So that lets us track memes and narratives. And then AI is also getting into detecting deep fakes and bot hordes and the tactics of disinformation that are becoming more and more common, as I was saying, both in between countries, as the Brookings Institute is showing recently. There's a lot of disinformation between countries, but also in domestic sources, you see the tactics that big actors like Russia or China use being replicated by domestic interests and domestic actors.
So Zach, so it's interesting. You gave a good layout of how Nexalogy uses the AI to address disinformation, or at least try to understand and map it. But I'm wondering, in your work, is there also an aspect where AI is playing a role in enabling disinformation?
Yes, there is. And that's a good point, because the bots are getting better and the deepfakes are getting more convincing, and there is definitely nefarious AI, by foreign actors that is a real factor. The thing that is very difficult for people to wrap their heads around, but which is, takes a little bit of thinking, is that machines game each other's algorithms, right? So that's sometimes difficult to conceptualize when we think about reading a tweet, or when we think about reading, a Reddit subreddit. But there are tactics that we've seen in our work that show that the disinformation is not just about text or just about images. It has to do with gaming the algorithms that the platforms use to promote their content. So it can get very complicated in the sense that when you have a machine trying to take advantage of the other machine in order to look real and to get promoted, and it succeeds, then you see these amplification aspects that are like I say, an evolving field.
So the governments have really become focused on the issue of disinformation around the U.S. politics, but also in Canada. We're seeing, many countries try to address this challenge. I'm wondering if you could touch upon, or if you've seen any legislative or policy or regulatory measures governments have put in place to counter disinformation. What are you seeing? What are governments? How are they responding to this?
Well, disinformation is hitting the mainstream. Like, we're seeing a moment in popular consciousness and popular culture where people are starting to become aware of the scale of disinformation, which it's funny because, it's been since 2016 that the media has been talking about this. But in the States, you see the Disinfo Cloud, the Global Engagement Center. These are efforts to map continuously disinformation. You see EU versus Disinfo, another American and NATO initiative that is making an effort to map disinformation and to align and gather resources. On the more municipal level in the United States, you see bans against facial recognition, for example, with the Clearview AI situation. In Canada, you see the Privacy Commissioner recently making statements and working in general to understand how we can protect Canadian rights. The CDI in Canada is good, or like the recent thing that everybody's talking about, example of like GAFA versus the government in Australia, right? Where there's deplatforming and education councils and revenue affect, legislative measures that affect revenue for news sharing. I have found that the EU, has a lot of funding initiatives, but which are very specifically focused to the EU about disinformation. I think this is because they're so close to Russia. And, there's a tension between the ability to legislate, like what Minister Guilbeault here in Canada is trying to do, and some of his initiatives are very interesting. And the fact that the platforms the big platforms always say to government and legislatures, you don't understand, right? You don't understand the reality. You don't understand what we're doing. You're trying to make a legislative solution to a technological problem that we've got figured out that you don't understand. I do also see government elements starting to say just deleting things is not the answer. Just taking things out. Like some people say, if you take it down, everything will be fine, right? But that's kind of naive. So I think that governments are starting to mature insofar as how they approach this.
So Zach, one thing I would like to ask you is, you talked a bit about the tech companies, about how, there's this kind of pushback, there's talk of regulation, companies say you don't understand. What positive measures have we seen some of these big tech companies put in place to deal with disinformation? I mean, they've been under enormous pressure. What are they doing, or can you cite any examples that are worthy of us knowing about?
Well, the Council for Adjudication that Facebook is using to determine, for example, if President Donald Trump should be allowed to come back on the platform or not, is an interesting example. Content moderation is definitely becoming more of a priority for the companies. They've become really aggressive in taking down content, as we all know, since January 6th and the events at the Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. And deplatforming is also a phenomenon that they undertake. I think, there's a lot of reliance on crowdsourcing, which can be problematic because there is such a thing as like the lowest common denominator kind of exercising a type of tyranny over people who may have a more enlightened view. And really the companies, their first line of defense was always crowdsourcing. They wanted the people to police each other. And now we see that they've gone beyond that. It's had positive impacts for certain other companies like Twitter on their stock price and such. But the jury is out on whether deplatforming at scale is going to work in favor of democracy or whether it will be risky.
So now we're getting really at the center of our discussion here. You talk about deplatforming, and there are increasing voices that are saying we have to be careful, because as much as we want to deal with disinformation as well as other online harms, there is a real danger in which we could erode important human rights, such as the right to freedom of opinion and the right to freedom of expression. I'm wondering, how do you see this moving forward, and what should be the role of governments in looking at this space if private sector companies are making these decisions, but they touch upon these fundamental human rights? How should we look at this going forward?
Well, I think, ethical development of AI is a priority along with human rights development of AI. And I think that robust democratic institutions are like the best solution, along with the understanding that AI and social media, for example, go together like electricity and telephones. There is a public good role that these platforms play, whether they want to or not, whether they set out to do that or not. And governments deserve to have some levers on those companies, even if they're private companies in pursuit of profit. There's a reason to have human rights commissions and norms and standards. Business human rights is a growing area of research, and we've worked with, for example, the Democracy Labs, on things like CSA 2020 in the American election, where there's a hashtag to report voter intimidation, and civil society and industry work together to try and protect rights, right? And we've worked with the Canadian government to look at disinformation in our elections, which is an important thing that shouldn't be controversial. So I think because any COVID situation, which we've also looked at with in relation to Chinese to COVID disinformation, any election is going to dovetail with disinformation and COVID right now. So I think it's really important that civil society and government, and big platforms, the big platforms are not necessarily going to do the things that civil society and industry are going to do, and even government is kind of a small player in comparison to these platforms to some extent, because these platforms are global and they're very profitable. So education about what constitutes positive digital citizenship is really important. And we all enjoy memes, and viral zaniness of the internet, but we also have to have norms and standards and rights that make the internet safe. So we only have so much time and attention in our daily lives. And I think the point is that when AI starts to affect that, we have to be vigilant and careful.
So Zach, I want to just thank you for joining us today, for sharing your knowledge. Your company, Nexalogy and Data Metrics AI, does some really interesting work. I know we worked together on several projects, and I think we'll learn a lot, and the OSCE and member states will learn a lot about what you shared with us today. Thank you.
Thanks, Kyle. I really appreciate it. Have a great day.